Were you able to come up with a solution for fixing the display of the series, issue number, published on, and average rating fields on the Add Comic Book page? Let's take a look at my solution. I decided to add display attributes to the properties that are being passed to the Label4 HTML helper method. The Label4 method will use the display attributes name property for the label text if it's available. Otherwise, it'll use the name of the property as it's doing now. Let's add the necessary attributes. Brackets, display, and press Ctrl period or dot to add a using directive for the system, component model, data annotations namespace, parentheses, and then set the name property to the text that you want to use for the label. For the series ID property, let's use series. Now, let's add display attributes to the issue number, published on, and average rating properties. For issue number, let's use issue number with a space between the words, published on with a space between the words, and the same thing for average rating. Now the labels are displaying the expected text, series, issue number, published on, and average rating. The code in the Web App Project's controllers and views should be familiar to you if you have some experience with ASP.NET MVC. If you need a refresher on the basics of ASP.NET MVC, see the teacher's notes for other Treehouse resources that can help get you up to speed. Before we wrap up this section, let's review a new technique for passing data to views. In the Comic Books controller add_getAction method, notice that we're passing an instance of the Comic Books addViewModel class to our view. And the view is strongly typed to the same Comic Books addViewModel class. Let's go to the definition of that class by putting the cursor on the class name and pressing F12. The Comic Books addViewModel class is a type of class known as a view model. As the name suggests, it's a model for a view. Having a view model gives you a way to bundle up everything that the view needs in order to render its content. In previous courses, we used the view method to pass an entity object instance to the view and the viewBag object to pass any additional data items, like select list objects or collections of select list items. While that worked, the viewBag object is a dynamic object, which makes it easy to define new properties from the controller action method. But from the view, it prevents Visual Studio from being able to help you to discover what properties are available. Strongly typing our view to an associated view model class allows Visual Studio IntelliSense to provide you with a list of the available properties. This helps reduce the chance for simple errors in your view code, like mistyping a viewBag property name. Using a view model also gives us a way to extend the entity or entities that a view is designed to work with. For instance, when adding a comic book using the Add Comic Book page, in addition to providing the required property values on the comic book entity, we need to select an artist and role for the comic book's first artist. The comic book entity includes an artist property, which is a collection of comic book artist entities. But the drop-down lists for the artist and role fields need integer properties to bind to in order to capture the selected artist and role IDs. We could update the comic book entity with artist ID and role ID properties and decorate them with not mapped attributes in order to prevent EF from including them in our data model. But this approach unnecessarily pollutes the comic book entity with properties that are only needed for the Add Comic Book page to function properly. Our view model gives us a way to define artist ID and role ID properties, in addition to the comic book entity property that is defined in the comic book space view model base class. The comic book space view model base class defines the properties that are in common between the add comic book and edit comic book pages. We can also use a view model's class constructor to initialize property values. Here, we're setting default values on the comic book object instance. The init method provides a way for the controller action method to initialize the view model. In this particular case, the init method is being used to initialize select list properties. In the next section, we'll update this method to use our database context to query the necessary series, artist, and role data for these select list objects.
It's not necessary for every view to have an associated view model. As with just about anything, only use view models when it makes sense to do so. For instance, if a view only needs a single data item, like a list of entity object instances, then it's okay to just pass the collection from the controller action method to the view using the view method. In the next section, we'll start updating our web app to use EF. As we do that, you'll find it helpful to be familiar with the comic book data model defined in the class library. If you need to familiarize yourself with the data model, see the teacher's notes for an overview. See you after the break.